AP Cram, the AP Human Geography exam. Free response question 6. Economic development in Mexico and Brazil. Remember that Section 2 consists of free response questions. There are 3 questions that should be formatted as short essay answers, and you have 75 minutes to complete them, so allocate your time properly. The free response section is 50% of your exam score. You're required to define and explain and apply geographic concepts and also interpret geographic data. Okay? Give examples of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. It's important to note that based on the time you have to complete Section 2, the exam administrators usually ask you to identify and explain 2 examples. Here, you're going to need to identify 8 examples because they just kind of sort of cover an exhaustive list of examples, 2 of which you should be able to recall on test day. So this isn't a perfectly fitting ideology for every single scenario, but what you can do is imagine the core as the halves. And imagine the periphery as the have-nots. So give an example of what a core could be below the national level. Well, you can have a central business district. And if you have a central business district, of course, you would have a zone of transition that's either becoming a central business district, and you'll also have like a residential zone in this region or a suburb. Well, the residential suburban component isn't exactly befitting as a have-not, because these people are usually more well-to-do than people at or below the poverty line. Give a second example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied beneath the national scale. All right, so let's say you have a city at the core. Can you think of what would lie in the periphery? I'll give you a moment to think. There you would have a suburb, an edge city, or rural hinterland, just something that's less developed and industrialized and concreted like a city, okay? Not necessarily a place of have-nots, although it could be, but just less developed, less built up. Give a third example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. All right, so let's say you're given a small town as the core. What could be considered a complementary periphery? That would be remote areas or rural hinterlands, okay? The boondocks. Although that's not politically correct, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. Mention a fourth example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. So let's say you have a political center at the core. What would be a complementary periphery region? That would be a less powerful center area or region, okay? Having less influence. What is the fifth example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national level or scale? So let's say a large primate city or metropolitan area is at the core. What would you expect to find at the periphery? I'll give you a moment to think. Well, you would expect to find either a small or medium city or a non-metropolitan area or region. What is the sixth example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. All right, so let's say you're told a populated area or region lies at the core. What would you or who would you expect to find in the periphery? I'll give you a moment to think. Well, you would expect to find a less populated area or region, okay? So anything along the lines of this answer is acceptable. Doesn't have to be verbatim, but conceptually related without any extraneous incorrect information. Give a seventh example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. So let's say you're told a productive area lies at the core. What would you find in the periphery, the surrounding outskirts? You would find a less developed, impoverished area or region, okay? Give an eighth example of how the core-periphery concept can be applied below the national scale. Let's say you have a core state or province laying at the core. What would you expect to find in the periphery surrounding region? Okay, I'll give you a moment to think. You could expect to find a peripheral state or province. If you mention any of the aforementioned 8 opposing, polarities as far as core versus periphery, you would get full credit. Well, that is mentioning them in an essay form.